Welcome to Telling Tales, the place to get your fiction fix. In each episode, we'll have a story for you. Maybe you'll find yourself in a far-flung corner of the world, or deep in the French countryside, or even on the banks of the River Tyne. We'll take you to places where the past and the present merge. Rocks talk, and a curry can kill you. Sometimes funny, sometimes dark, but always entertaining. Welcome to Telling Tales. Bigos Stew with Dumplings. Henrik and I first met at Sacred Heart Primary School. It was 1953. We were 5 years old. The head teacher, Sister Hewitt, sat us both together at the front of the class. I was there because I was so short-sighted and would have preferred to sit at the back by the window so I could look out on the playground. School bored me. My attention span was shorter than my school trousers, and I preferred the anonymity of the back row. Today, I probably would have a classroom assistant allocated to me because of my dyslexia, but dyslexia hadn't been invented then, so I was just one of the thickos that Sister Hewitt would constantly express her disappointment in. Henrik was pleased to be at the front because he wanted to learn. He was a really clever kid and seemed to know the answer to everything. Jet black hair and a Polish surname that I'd never be able to spell properly. He told me he lived with his mother, that his dad had been a Polish Air Force pilot who was killed in the war. It was only later I realised that, like me, he was born in 1948, meaning the war had been over for at least 2 years when he was conceived. I didn't know much about conception at the time, except Sister Hewitt told us that Jesus was an immaculate conception, but I didn't understand that either. We both loved comics and would talk about the Eagle, which was our favourite, especially Dan Dare's adventures fighting the mighty Mekong. Neither of us were very good at sports. I was clumsy. He was totally uninterested. He ended up going to the grammar school, and I went to the technical college. Education was strictly divided in those days. Newcastle was a huge engineering hub. The massive Armstrong's munitions factory was spread along the west part of the city. Along its banks to the east was shipyard after shipyard. They were all fed with the iron ore that came down from the hills around, and coal that was dug out from below. Everything was based on the needs of industry. Clever kids went to grammar school. They'd be the managers, designers, and engineers. We were the factory fodder, who would build the ships and tanks, smelt the steel, and together make the burghers of the city wealthy. We lived only a few streets apart, and I would often spend my weekends at his house. Our small terraced house was overcrowded with my brothers and sisters, and he was the only child living with his mother. She worked for the local council. I'm not sure what she did there. He also lived with his grandma, who did the cooking. Her speciality was a Bigos stew with dumplings. It was nothing like the stews my mother used to make, which were made with chewy beef. It was hot and spicy with pork, pepper, garlic and paprika, and something I later found out was sauerkraut. Babka, that's what he called his grandmother. She had a strange accent, and her English wasn't very good, and at first she was hard to understand. I liked her. She taught me to cook. It turned out I wasn't bad at cooking. Babka said I had a nose for it. She would say, "Don't taste it first, smell it." Then she'd ask me to identify the different ingredients, taught me how to build layers of flavour. And when I got it right, she praised me and kissed me on the head and called me her Mishkov. She said she was proud of me, and so far in my life no one, not even my own mother, had ever done that. Babka knew what she was doing, and her recipes would definitely make her proud as well. Borscht, or beetroot soup, was always on the menu, along with mashed potato stuffed dumplings called pierogi. She also taught me 1,000 things to do with cabbage, from stuffed rolls to an egg noodle and bacon sauté. Kielbasa, the king of smoked sausages, was also a must. Alongside recipes, she taught me a little of her language, one word at a time. So that was my weekend. I'd go to his place and Babka and I would cook, and Henrik would practice his guitar. And when he was 11, his mother bought him a second-hand upright piano. It didn't take him long to master that as well. I loved the fact that he filled the house with the sound of the guitar, the piano, although I have to say at first he was a bit rubbish. On Saturday mornings, we get the bus into the city centre and go to the music shop. And there he'd buy sheet music with his pocket money. They had a large Steinway grand piano in the window of the store. He'd sometimes play it. Eddie, who ran the shop, would encourage him to play, and Henrik loved to show off. The adults were always saying nice things to him, and he lapped it up. One Saturday, we arrived to find the piano had gone, and in its place was a long bench filled with boxes of 45-inch records, and a little booth where you could put on headphones and listen to the music. 2 of us would cram into the booth. He would listen on one side of the headphones and I was on the other. And soon the talk changed from comics to records. This was the 60s, and our world was changing. In 1963 we were 14 when we first heard Please Please Me by the Beatles, and we looked at each other, and we both grinned so hard I thought our ears would fall off. After the store, we sometimes go to Eldon Square. It was a grassy area in the heart of the city. All the young people would gather there. Sometimes they'd bring guitars and we'd sing along. Cliff Richard, Buddy Holly, Elvis, and of course Beatles songs. One Saturday, he brought his guitar down as well, and immediately I could see he was a cut above the others. And soon the crowd would gather around him, and everybody would join in the singing. I've never heard him sing before, and he actually has a great voice. It boomed out, and even with 20 other kids singing along, his voice soared above them. One day, he sang a song called Today is the Beginning. I'd never heard that before, and neither had anybody else. It was a bit like a Beatles song with a bit of Buddy Holly thrown in, and the crowd lapped it up, and there was a huge round of applause when he finished. All the girls crowded around him, wanting to know whose song it was. He told them he'd written it, and they were definitely impressed. As we got the bus back home, I asked him if it really his song, and he said yes, it was. And he'd written a lot more. But soon after that, he went to university, and we lost touch for a while. I went to the local catering college and eventually passed my exams and got a job in the kitchens at a local hotel. It was hard work and the hours were long, but I loved it. The buzz of the kitchens, the energy, the camaraderie of the chefs was amazing. I was really lucky as the head chef was French and he took a shine to me. He liked my attitude and asked who taught me to cook, and I told him about Babka. And from that moment on, he took me under his wing and eventually became the sous chef in one of the best restaurants in Newcastle. I met my wife there. She ran the front of house. Her name was Anna, and she was Polish. I impressed her with my Polish. But when I said I was Babka's little Miskov, she laughed, and I asked her what was funny about it, and she said it meant little mouse, and I thought it meant good boy. I didn't mind, though, and after that it was her pet name for me. We were married 12 months after that in the cathedral in Newcastle. It was a brilliant day. As it was a Monday and the restaurant was closed, the chef let me have it for reception. Anna's family came from Poland. With Babka, the women took over the kitchen and made a banquet for us I'll never forget. Polish food has a reputation of being basic peasant food, but when it comes to showing off at a wedding, their food can stand alongside the best I've ever had. The party began with cold appetizers, cheese, meat, pâté, herring of course, and a vegetable tray. An hour later, pork loin, grilled meat, smoked fish, roast chicken, and even some tripe, when we all thought we couldn't eat any more. Babka's Bigos Stew with Dumplings arrived to a loud cheer and applause from Anna's family. My family were also impressed. They got along really well with Anna, My dad said he liked her because she kept me on a tight lead. Although my mother never showed her feelings much, she did see how beautiful Anna looked, and she was glad I'd smartened myself up. But I could see she was happy for me, and that meant a lot. It was some years later when Henrik turned up at my door. He said he'd dropped out of university and gone to America and joined a band. They'd recorded an album at the famous Abbey Road studios in London. It was called Today Was the Beginning, and he'd just got the first copy, and we played it together. It was in a plain sleeve, there was no track list, and despite the fact we're very different, his lyrics spoke of a changing world, the fear we all felt of the future. It was chilling and not always easy to listen to. You felt as if he knew your secret thoughts and had written songs about it. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, and I loved it. And so did everybody else. It was a huge worldwide hit. I still have that copy. I asked him to sign it for me, and he laughed and said no. But in the end he did, and later I had it framed and hung on the wall of the living room in our house. It's up in my office now. It's probably worth a fortune, but I'd never sell it. Listening to that album that day was the last time I'd see him for 5 years. After that, the only time I would see him was on Top of the Pops, or the TV, or in the newspapers after some bust-up at a party, or photograph of the endless streams of girlfriends in the newspapers. He also changed his name to something easier to pronounce. He was Henry now. I wrote to him often, but he never replied. I'd invited him to the wedding, but he never came. And when my son was born, I asked Anna if it was all right to call him Henrik, and she said yes. It was a good Polish name. I wrote to Henry and told him and asked him if he'd be his godfather and come to the christening. No one was more surprised than me when he turned up. He was so skinny. He had a gaunt, haunted look about him. His skin was sallow and he didn't look well at all. In the small hours of the morning we talked. He said his life was out of control, constantly touring, recording, interviews. He knew he took too many drugs, but it seemed like the only way to keep going. I asked him why he had to keep going like that, when it was probably going to kill him. He didn't answer for a while. And then he said, "No one's ever asked me that question before." And then he added, "It feels obvious, but at the moment, when it's happening, you feel you have no choice." He said he envied my life and was so pleased and honoured to be Henrik's godfather. I asked him to stay with us for a while and get some medical help, and he nodded and said he'd think about it. When we got up in the morning, he was gone. A year or so later, I saw in the press that the band had split up and he was in rehab somewhere. I got a long letter full of apologies and promises that he would make it up to me. And from then on, we pretty much wrote to each other once a month. I've kept all the letters. He became just like his old self, and for the next 30 years he would come to see us. He loved to stay, and the kids loved him. He never performed in public again, and he'd often get his guitar out and sing to the kids. He released a studio album. Nearly every great name in the music industry recorded one of his songs. Dolly, Johnny Cash, Sting, loads of them. He had a studio in the beachside house in the Bahamas, and there he'd write and people would come to record tracks, but every summer he'd take 2 weeks off. Sometimes we'd go to the Bahamas to see him. He got his strength back, and it showed in his songs. They may have lost the edgy lyrics of his youth, but the tenderness, the feelings that came through in his later work were so beautiful. When I listened to them, I'd sometimes cry. 6 months ago, his housekeeper went to wake him when he didn't come down from his morning coffee. He died in his sleep. He was 70 years old. The coroner's inquest said it was heart failure. I guess the years of drug abuse had taken its toll. He'd never married and had no children. His house and all his future royalties were donated to a charity that he ran with Dolly Parton to help educate the children of the West Indies, in particular to encourage and support music teaching across the islands. The rest of his estate went to me, with a large portion in trust for Henrik and his sister Emma to be used for their education. The rest I used to start up my own restaurant. Anna's in front of house, and I run the brigade in the kitchen. I called it Wisniewski in memory of my friend. We serve traditional Polish food with a British twist. Food is seasonal, but there's always a Bigos stew on the menu. If you enjoyed this episode, then please support my podcast by buying me a coffee. It's £2 a cup. Click the heart logo in the top corner of the website page to donate. If you're on another podcast provider, then check out buymeacoffee.com and search for Jeff Price N3. Thank you. You can contact Telling Tales direct by emailing tellingtalesjeffprice@gmail.com. Until the next time, goodbye.